Story 1. The Showagon Silence Beverly Potts, 1951. In the late summer of 1951, a 10-year-old girl named Beverly Potts was given a rare gift: permission to stay out late for a neighborhood festival in Cleveland, Ohio. She was a shy, cautious child who never broke the rules, surrounded by hundreds of neighbors in a brightly lit park. She was exactly where a child should be on a warm August night, just a few hundred feet from the safety of her front door. But instead of walking into her house to tell her parents about the music and the lights, Beverly would simply evaporate into the humid night air, leaving behind a neighborhood that saw everything but noticed nothing. The mystery is not just that she vanished, but how a child so afraid of strangers could disappear from a crowded path while walking toward the only place she ever felt safe, leaving a trail that grew cold before the morning sun even rose. Tonight, I am going to tell you 10 stories about people who encountered the strange, the dark, and the mysterious in ways they never could have prepared for. But before we get into our first case, if you could please do me a huge favor. If you enjoy these stories, please offer to buy the like button, a nice cold soda at a summer festival, but then the second it turns to watch the stage, I want you to vanish into the crowd without saying a single word. Also, if you wouldn't mind, please subscribe to the channel and leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are listening from today. We love seeing how far these stories travel across the globe. Now, let us get into our first story. The air in Cleveland that night was heavy with the kind of thick, Midwestern humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin. It was Friday, August 24th, 1951, in the West Park area. You could hear the faint, brassy notes of a trumpet floating over the rooftops from Halloran Park. The Showagon, a portable stage on wheels, was the center of the universe for the local kids. The scent of burnt popcorn and sticky sweet cotton candy hung in the air, mingling with the smell of damp grass and the ozone that lingers after a summer rain. It was a night built for memories, the kind that define a childhood before the school year starts. Beverly Potts was a 10-year-old girl who looked exactly like the era she lived in. She had golden blonde hair that her mother, Elizabeth, would carefully curl every morning. She was small for her age, with a shy smile and a cautious nature that made her stay close to home. Beverly was not the type of kid to go looking for trouble. In fact, she was so obedient that her parents rarely had to raise their voices. She was the anchor of their quiet life. That evening, Beverly had a very specific goal. She wanted to see the performances at the park. Her father, Robert, worked as a tool and die maker, a man of routine and hard work. Her mother was the heart of the home on Linnet Avenue. At first, they told Beverly she could not go. It was getting late, and the park would be crowded. But Beverly persisted, her eyes wide with hope, until Elizabeth finally gave in, a decision she would replay for decades. The rule was simple. Beverly had to be home by 9:30. Not 9:31, not 9:40, 9:30. To Beverly, that rule was sacred. She put on her favorite outfit, a blue and white playsuit, and laced up her dark blue loafers. She even wore a small gold ring that she treated like a royal treasure. She met up with her friend Patricia Adams, and the two of them grabbed their bicycles, their hearts racing with the thrill of a rare night out. They pedaled down the quiet streets of West Park, the tires of their bikes humming against the pavement. When they reached the edge of Halloran Park, Beverly began to worry. There were so many people, so many bikes. What if someone took theirs? It was a classic Beverly thought. Cautious, protective, fearful of breaking the peace. She looked at Patricia and insisted they go back. They had to park the bikes safely at home first. They were rule followers. So they turned around, pedaled back to their houses, and tucked the bicycles away in the safety of their garages. Then they set out again, this time on foot. It took longer, but Beverly felt better. They walked back to the park, joining the stream of neighbors heading toward the music. The park was a sea of faces. There were kids sitting on their father's shoulders and couples holding hands under the glow of the strings of yellow light bulbs. Beverly and Patricia found a spot near the front, mesmerized by the magicians and the young singers on the Showagon stage. For an hour, the world was perfect. But as the clock edged closer to 9, the two girls decided it was time to start the journey back. They did not want to be late. As they reached the edge of the park, Patricia headed toward her house, and Beverly began the walk down Linnet Avenue alone. She was only a few blocks from her door. The transition from the bright lights of the festival to the dim, tree-lined streets was subtle at first. The noise of the crowd began to fade into a rhythmic hum, replaced by the chirping of crickets. Beverly had a distinct way of walking, a slight limp because one leg was just a fraction shorter than the other. A neighbor who was sitting on their porch later recalled seeing that familiar silhouette walking past under the yellow glow of a street lamp. Beverly was moving at a steady pace, her head down, probably thinking about the performers she had just seen. She passed the 2000 block of Linnet Avenue. She was less than 100 yards from her own front porch. The lights in the windows of the houses she passed were warm and inviting. To anyone watching, she was just a young girl finishing a perfect summer night. But in that short stretch of sidewalk, something shifted in the universe. One moment, there was the sound of her loafers clicking on the concrete. The next, there was only the wind. There was no struggle heard. No scream pierced the night. No brakes squealed on the asphalt. Beverly Potts simply ceased to exist in the physical world. It was as if she had walked through a door that only she could see, a door that locked behind her the moment she stepped through. The street remained empty, silent, and indifferent to what had happened. Inside the Potts house, Elizabeth was watching the clock. It was 9:30. She looked at the door, expecting to hear the turn of the knob. 9:40 came and went. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that starts to feel heavy when someone you love is missing. Elizabeth walked to the front window and pulled back the curtain. The street was dark. The festival noise was a ghost of itself now, a distant vibration. She felt a cold prickle of skin. She called out for Robert. Together, they walked out onto the porch, calling Beverly's name into the darkness. Their voices echoed off the neighboring houses, but there was no answer. They began to walk the route she should have taken, their pace quickening from a stroll to a panicked run. They checked the park, peering into the shadows of the playground equipment, asking the last few stragglers if they had seen a little girl in a blue and white suit. By midnight, the Cleveland police were involved. What followed was one of the largest searches in the history of Ohio. Thousands of volunteers joined the police, combing through every backyard, every basement, and every crawl space in the West Park area. They searched the nearby woods and even drained parts of the local ponds. Every neighbor was questioned, every registered sex offender in the state was tracked down, but Beverly was gone. The investigation uncovered strange, disjointed details. There were reports of a man in a tan car seen idling near the park earlier that day. There was talk of a mysterious figure seen walking behind Beverly near the end of the block, but nothing solid ever materialized. The police received thousands of tips, most of them dead ends. The gold ring she wore, the blue loafers, the golden hair, none of it ever turned up in a pawn shop or a landfill. You have to put yourself in that neighborhood. It is 1951. You know everyone on your block. Your kids play together, you share tools over the fence. You feel like you are part of a fortress. But then, a child vanishes from under your nose. Do you start looking at your neighbor differently? Do you wonder if the man who delivers your mail or the guy who fixed your car was watching her? Because the truth is, the predator was likely someone there. Someone who knew the timing of the festival. Someone who knew that a young girl would be walking home alone on that specific path. Fair didn't have time to choose, but Beverly didn't even have time to realize a choice was being made for her. The bizarre reveal came not in the days after, but decades later. In 2001, on the 50th anniversary of her disappearance, a local newspaper received a series of chilling, anonymous letters. The writer claimed to know exactly what happened to Beverly. They described her clothing and her ring with terrifying accuracy. They spoke of a man who had lived in the neighborhood, a man who had passed away years before, who had taken Beverly and disposed of her in a way that ensured she would never be found. The letters were filled with a sense of twisted regret, but they offered no location, no closure, and no justice for the little girl. The mystery of Beverly Potts remains a scar on the city of Cleveland. Robert and Elizabeth Potts spent the rest of their lives in that house on Linnet Avenue. They never changed the locks. They kept the porch light on every single night for over 50 years, hoping that the darkness would eventually give her back. They passed away without ever knowing if their daughter had suffered or if she had simply walked into another world, leaving a void that could never be filled. The silence that settled over Linnet Avenue that night in 1951 never truly lifted. It became a permanent part of the landscape, a reminder that horror does not always come with a warning. It can be as quiet as a footfall on a sidewalk. But while the story of Beverly Potts froze in time in Ohio, 7 hours away in the city of Chicago, another pair of sisters was about to step out into the winter cold, chasing a dream that would lead them into the same darkness. Story 2? The Elvis Tickets Grimes? 1956. The wind in Chicago during the month of December does not just blow, it bites. It is a sharp, freezing predator that hunts for any exposed skin, turning your breath into a thick white cloud the second it leaves your lungs. On the night of December 28, 1956, the temperature was hovering just above 0 degrees Fahrenheit. The snow on the ground was old and crusty, reflecting the flickering neon lights of the Brighton Park Theater. Inside that theater, the air was a complete contrast. It was warm and heavy with the smell of buttered popcorn and the faint, sweet scent of hairspray. The sound of Elvis Presley singing "Love Me Tender" echoed off the walls, a velvet voice that made every girl in the room feel like he was looking directly at them. For 15-year-old Barbara Grimes and her 13-year-old sister Patricia, this was their version of heaven. They were safe, warm, and happy. Barbara and Patricia were the kind of sisters who did everything together. They shared a bedroom, they shared secrets, and most importantly, they shared a massive, borderline obsessive crush on the king of rock and roll. Barbara was the more mature one, with a steady gaze and a protective streak for her younger sister. Patricia was energetic, with a laugh that could be heard from across their small house on Damon Avenue. They were the pride of their mother, Loretta. Loretta Grimes was a hardworking woman who kept a tight ship, but she knew how much this movie meant to her girls. They had already seen Love Me Tender 10 times, but on this particular Friday, they begged for one more trip. They promised to be home by midnight. Loretta looked at their excited faces, checked the few dollars in her purse, and handed over the bus fare. She trusted them implicitly. They were good kids who never missed a curfew in their lives. The preparation for the night was a ritual in itself. Barbara spent 30 minutes in front of the mirror, carefully pinning her hair into a style she had seen in a magazine. Patricia was busy making sure they had enough change for the bus, counting the nickels and dimes out onto the kitchen table. They put on their heavy winter coats, Barbara in her favorite gray coat and Patricia in her bright yellow one, and wrapped their scarves tightly around their necks. They walked to the bus stop at the corner of Damon and Archer, their boots crunching on the frozen slush. The bus ride was a 20-minute journey through the industrial heart of Chicago. They talked about which Elvis song was the best and wondered if he would ever come to their neighborhood. When they arrived at the Brighton Park Theater, they stood in line, their breath hitching with excitement. They bought 2 tickets and 2 boxes of popcorn and found their seats. For the next few hours, the outside world did not exist. There was only the flickering silver screen and the music. They watched the film twice, staying for the double feature because they could not bear to leave. During the second showing, a friend of theirs from school saw them sitting in the balcony, laughing and eating popcorn. They looked perfectly normal, perfectly safe, but as the final credits rolled and the house lights came up, the safety of the theater vanished. The sisters walked out of the lobby and back into the freezing Chicago night. It was approximately 11:30 at night. They were seen by several other teenagers standing on the corner, waiting for the bus that would take them south toward home. The streets were quiet, the traffic sparse because of the bitter cold. One witness later recalled seeing them talking to a man in a dark car, but the detail was fuzzy, a fleeting moment lost in the shadows. Back at the house on Damon Avenue, Loretta Grimes was sitting at the kitchen table. She had a pot of coffee brewing, the aroma filling the small room. She looked at the clock. It was 12:15. Her brow furrowed. The girls were 15 minutes late. She told herself the bus was probably delayed by the snow. She waited another 15 minutes. Then another. By 1 in the morning, the coffee was cold, and the silence in the house had become deafening. She put on her own coat and walked to the bus stop. She stood there for an hour, watching the headlights of every approaching vehicle, her heart jumping into her throat every time a bus slowed down. But the doors would open to reveal an empty platform or a lone worker heading home from a late shift. Her daughters were not on any of them. The realization began to sink in, a cold, heavy weight in her chest. Her girls were not just late, they were gone. By 2 in the morning, Loretta was at the police station. She was frantic, her voice trembling as she described the gray coat and the yellow coat. But in 1956, the police were often slow to act on missing teenagers. They told her the girls had probably just run off to Nashville to see Elvis. They told her to go home and sleep it off. But Loretta knew better. She knew her daughters would never leave her like this. She knew something terrible had happened. What followed was a search that paralyzed the city of Chicago. Hundreds of police officers and thousands of volunteers combed through parks, abandoned buildings, and the freezing waters of the Chicago River. Elvis Presley himself even issued a statement over the radio, pleading for the girls to go home to their mother. But as the days turned into weeks, the hope began to flicker out. The gray and yellow coats had disappeared into the winter landscape. You have to ask yourself, if you were in Loretta's shoes, would you have felt safe letting them go? It was only 2.5 miles. It was a route they had taken dozens of times. It was a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. You think you know the streets you walk on every day, but do you really? Because the same sidewalks that lead you to the theater can also lead you into a nightmare that has no exit, and there is no way to know which one you are on. The bizarre reveal happened on January 22nd, 1957, almost a month after the girls vanished. A man named Leonard Prescott was driving down a remote, snow-covered stretch of Williams Road in suburban Hinsdale. He saw something in a ditch near a guardrail. At first, he thought they were department store mannequins that someone had tossed out. But as he got closer, the breath left his body. It was Barbara and Patricia Grimes. They were lying on their backs, their bodies frozen solid by the extreme cold. But what baffled the investigators was the condition of the crime scene. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no obvious wounds, no gunshots, no stabs, no marks of violence at all. Their clothes were still neatly in place. It was as if they had simply laid down in the snow and died. The official autopsy report listed the cause of death as secondary shock due to exposure. But that explanation made no sense to anyone. Why would two healthy girls lay down in a ditch and freeze to death without trying to find help? There were houses with lights on just a few hundred yards away. Why was there no evidence of where they had been for the previous 3 weeks? Some people believed they had been held captive in a warm environment before being dumped, but the forensics of the 1950s could not prove it. The case was a ghost. The Grimes sisters' murder remains one of the most famous unsolved cases in the history of Illinois. It shattered the innocence of the city. Loretta Grimes never stopped looking for answers, keeping a shrine to her daughters in her living room until the day she died in 1989. She believed until her final breath that someone in that dark car at the bus stop had taken them, but the identity of that person remains locked in the frozen past. The tragedy of the Grimes sisters was a warning that the things we love, the things that make us feel happy and safe, can sometimes be the very things that lead us into the dark. A simple night at the movies turned into a mystery that a city could never solve. But while Chicago was mourning its lost daughters, across the country in Oregon, another family was packing their car for a simple trip into the woods, unaware that they were about to vanish just as completely. Story 3, The Christmas Greenery, Martin, 1958. The smell of fresh pine is usually a scent that brings comfort and joy. It is the smell of the holidays, of family, and of warm memories. But in the jagged cliffs of the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon, that scent is different. In December, it is mixed with the metallic tang of freezing river water and the earthy, decaying smell of wet ferns. On December 7th, 1958, the air was heavy with a mist so thick it felt like a cold blanket pressing against your skin. Kenneth Martin Sr. was 54 years old and the kind of man who was the bedrock of his community in Portland. He worked at a power company and was known for his steady hands and his even temper. His wife, Barbara, was 48. A woman who lived for her 3 children. There was Barbie, who was 10, Virginia, who was 11, and little Kenneth Jr., who was only 7 years old. They were a family that didn't just exist, they thrived in their small, happy world. To the neighbors on Northeast 57th Avenue, the Martins were the gold standard of a mid-century American family. Kenneth was the guy you could call if your car wouldn't start, and Barbara was the one who always had an extra batch of cookies for the neighborhood kids. Their house was always the first one on the block to have lights in the window and a wreath on the door. Christmas wasn't just a holiday for the Martins, it was their favorite season of the year. On that Sunday morning, the air in the Martin household was electric. They had a very specific plan. Every year, they would drive out into the woods to find the perfect greenery for their Christmas decorations. They weren't just looking for a tree, they wanted boughs of cedar and holly to deck the halls of their home. It was a tradition that the children talked about for weeks leading up to it. It was supposed to be a day of laughter and simple outdoor fun. The process of leaving the house was a coordinated effort that took nearly an hour. Kenneth Sr. spent time in the garage, checking the oil and the tire pressure on their 1954 cream-colored Ford Country sedan station wagon. He was meticulous about his car, treating it with the same care he gave his job. He made sure the heater was working perfectly because he knew the temperature in the gorge would be at least 10 degrees colder than in the city. Inside, Barbara was busy packing a thermos of hot cocoa and a bag of sandwiches. She made sure each child had their heaviest coat, their warmest mittens, and their sturdiest boots. There was a lot of chatter and excitement as they piled into the car. Kenneth Jr. sat in the middle, sandwiched between his two older sisters. They had their favorite blankets draped over their laps. They were a picture of suburban peace as they backed out of the driveway. The drive out of Portland and toward the Columbia River Gorge was a journey of about 45 miles. As they drove, the city streets gave way to towering Douglas firs and massive basalt cliffs that lined the river. The Columbia River itself was a dark, churning ribbon of gray water, swollen by the recent winter rains. The family listened to the radio, singing along to carols, oblivious to the fact that the landscape was slowly changing from beautiful to treacherous. Around 4 in the afternoon, the Martins pulled into a small, cozy restaurant called the Paradise Bar and Grill in the town of Cascade Locks. The waitress who served them later remembered them clearly because they seemed so happy. They ordered a late lunch of burgers and fries. Kenneth Sr. sat at the head of the table checking his watch, while the kids colored on the back of the paper menus. Everything was normal. Everything was exactly as it should be. They left the restaurant just as the sun was beginning to dip behind the high ridges of the gorge. In December in Oregon, the light doesn't fade slowly. It disappears all at once. 1 minute the sky is a dull gray, and the next, it is pitch black. Kenneth Sr. climbed back into the driver's seat, adjusted his rearview mirror, and pulled the station wagon back onto the highway. They were only an hour away from home. They just needed to get back to Portland. But as the Ford Country sedan moved west, the weather began to turn. The light mist turned into a heavy, driving rain that made the windshield wipers struggle to keep up. The road was narrow, with the river on one side and a sheer rock wall on the other. The lights from the dashboard cast a soft glow on the faces of the children, who were starting to get sleepy from the long day. The heater hummed, creating a cozy pocket of warmth inside the metal frame. Kenneth Sr. gripped the steering wheel, his eyes narrowed as he peered through the darkness. The road was slick, covered in a thin layer of oil and water that made the tires feel light. He was a good driver. But the gorge is a place that demands respect. One wrong move, one patch of black ice, and the world can flip upside down. He focused on the white lines of the road, the rhythmic thud-thud of the tires against the pavement being the only sound in the car. The subtle shift happened somewhere near the town of Corbett. A truck driver heading in the opposite direction later reported seeing a cream-colored station wagon that seemed to be traveling a bit too fast for the conditions. He noticed that the taillights flickered for a second, then disappeared, as the car rounded a sharp bend near a steep drop-off. It didn't seem like much at the time. Cars disappear around bends all the time. It didn't register as a tragedy. But back in Portland, the neighbors started to notice something strange. The lights in the Martin house remained dark. The morning of Monday, December 8th came and went, and Kenneth Sr. didn't show up for work. This was unheard of. His boss called the house, but the phone just rang and rang in the empty hallway. By that evening, the police were at the front door. They found the breakfast dishes still in the sink. They found the Christmas lights ready to be hung. The search that followed was massive, but frustrated by the winter weather. Divers searched the river, and planes flew over the gorge, looking for any sign of a cream-colored car in the brush. For months, there was nothing. No tire tracks, no broken glass, no sign of the 5 people who had simply vanished. It was as if the forest had opened its mouth and swallowed them whole. The mystery of the Martin family became a dark legend in the Pacific Northwest. You have to put yourself in that car for a moment. You're heading home after a perfect day. You can see the lights of the city in the distance. You're thinking about the warm house waiting for you. Do you notice the slight slide of the rear tires? Do you feel the moment the car leaves the asphalt and meets the empty air? Because for the Martins, there was no time to react. The transition from a family outing to a cold, dark ending happened in a heartbeat. The bizarre reveal didn't come until May of 1959, 5 months after they disappeared. A drilling rig operating in the river near the Dalles Dam pulled up something horrific in its equipment. It was the bodies of Virginia and Barbie Martin. They were found miles away from where the car was thought to have gone off the road. The river had kept them for months, and now it was finally giving them back, but it offered no explanation for the others. The rest of the family, Kenneth Sr., Barbara, and little Kenneth Jr., were never found. Neither was the heavy, cream-colored station wagon. Even with modern sonar and underwater drones used in more recent years, the depths of the Columbia River have refused to give up the rest of its secrets. There are theories that the car is buried deep in the silt at the bottom of the gorge, a steel tomb for a family that just wanted to bring some greenery home for Christmas. The tragedy of the Martin family is a reminder that even the most cherished traditions can lead us to a place where the map ends. They were a family built on love and routine, and yet they were erased from the world in a single, rainy afternoon. Their story froze the heart of Portland for an entire generation. But as the decades passed and the mystery of the gorge remained unsolved, the world moved on into a new era, an era where the dangers changed. While the mountains of Oregon kept their secrets for nearly 70 years, the turn of the decade brought a different kind of fear to the suburbs of the Midwest. The innocence of the 1950s was gone, replaced by a darker reality that would be broadcast on the back of every milk carton. 700 miles away from the Columbia River, a young boy was about to step out onto a quiet street to deliver the morning news, unaware that he was being watched. Story 4. The Milk Carton Boy, Johnny Gosch, 1982. The pre-dawn air in West Des Moines, Iowa, on September 5, 1982, was perfectly still. It carried the scent of damp pavement and the sharp, earthy smell of wet grass. If you stood on the sidewalk of 42nd Street at 6 o'clock in the morning, the only thing you would hear was the rhythmic, metallic clacking of a small red wagon. It was a sound that meant the day was starting, a sound of reliability and a young boy's hard work. Johnny Gosch was 12 years old, and he was the kind of kid who took pride in being the first person awake on his block. He was energetic, with a bright smile, and a sense of responsibility that was rare for a middle schooler. To Johnny, his paper route wasn't just a chore, it was his business. He saved every penny he earned, dreaming of the things he could buy for his family. He was the golden boy of his neighborhood, a kid everyone knew and everyone trusted. His parents, John and Noreen Gosch, lived in a comfortable house where the back door was rarely locked. They encouraged Johnny's independence because they knew he was smart and capable. Every Sunday morning, Johnny would crawl out of bed while the rest of the world was still dreaming. He would put on his favorite baseball cap, whistle for his miniature dachshund Gretchen, and head out to meet the delivery truck. It was a routine as steady as the sunrise. The process began at 5:45 in the morning. Johnny would walk to the end of the driveway and wait for the bundle of newspapers to be tossed onto the curb. He would grab his heavy-duty shears and snip the thick plastic ties, the sound echoing in the silent street. Then came the folding. He would sit on the concrete, his fingers turning gray from the fresh ink, and fold each paper into a tight rectangle before sliding a thick rubber band around the middle. He would stack the papers meticulously in his red radio flyer wagon, making sure the weight was distributed evenly so it wouldn't tip over. Once the wagon was full, he would grab the black rubber handle and begin the trek. He knew every crack in the sidewalk, every house with a loose porch light, and exactly which bushes the neighborhood cats liked to hide in. Gretchen would trot alongside him, her little legs moving fast to keep up with his determined pace. Johnny followed a specific map he had memorized months ago. He would start at the corner house, walk up the 3 concrete steps, and place the paper exactly between the screen door and the frame. He never just threw them from the sidewalk. He wanted the service to be perfect. He would move from house to house, the red wagon trailing behind him like a loyal shadow. The morning was his time, a peaceful window before the traffic and the noise of the world took over. By 6:15, he was halfway through his route. He would pass the old oak tree near the park, its leaves just starting to turn brown at the edges. The street lamps were still on, casting long, distorted shadows across the lawns. Johnny was in the zone, his mind probably wandering to the breakfast his mother would have waiting for him. He was only a few blocks away from safety, doing the same mundane thing he had done hundreds of times before without any incident. The subtle shift happened when a blue sedan began to circle the block. It wasn't moving fast, just idling near the intersections. A neighbor who was up early to make coffee noticed the car but didn't think much of it. Then, a man approached Johnny near the corner of 42nd and Marquardt Lane. He asked for directions, his voice low and calm. Johnny, being the polite kid he was, stopped his wagon and pointed toward the main road. He was just being helpful. Gretchen, the little dachshund, began to growl, a low vibration in her throat that Johnny had never heard before. He looked down at his dog, then back at the man. The man didn't leave. He kept talking, moving closer into Johnny's personal space. The air suddenly felt colder. the silence of the morning feeling less like peace and more like a trap. Johnny gripped the handle of his wagon a little tighter, his instinct telling him that something was very wrong. Back inside the Gosh house, John Sr. woke up at 6:30. He noticed the house was too quiet. Usually by this time, he could hear Johnny and Gretchen coming back through the garage. He walked to the window and looked out at the driveway. It was empty. A small knot of anxiety began to form in his stomach. He told himself not to worry, that Johnny was probably just chatting with another carrier, but he decided to put on his shoes and go look anyway. He drove slowly down the route, scanning the sidewalks. He turned onto 42nd Street and saw something that made his heart stop. There, sitting perfectly still in the middle of the sidewalk, was the red wagon. It was still full of newspapers, the rubber bands neatly in place. Next to it, Gretchen was pacing in circles, whimpering and barking at the empty air. Johnny was nowhere to be seen. His hat was lying in the grass, tossed aside like it didn't matter. You have to imagine standing on that sidewalk in the quiet Iowa morning. You see the tools of your son's hard work just sitting there, abandoned. You call his name, but the only response is the rustle of the wind in the trees. Do you think he just ran off? Or do you realize in that instant that the world you thought was safe has just been torn open? Because for John Gosh, the realization was a physical blow, a silence that carried the weight of 1,000 screams. The search for Johnny Gosh became a national obsession. His face was one of the very first to ever be printed on the side of a milk carton, a haunting image that greeted millions of people at their breakfast tables every morning. The investigation led the police into dark corners of the country, uncovering rumors of organized rings and deep conspiracies. But for years, there were no sightings, no phone calls, and no clues that led to a living, breathing 12-year-old. The bizarre reveal came 15 years later, in the middle of a stormy night in 1997. Noreen Gosh was startled awake by a knock at her door. When she opened it, she saw a young man standing there, accompanied by another man who stayed in the shadows. The young man looked her in the eyes and told her that he was Johnny. He spoke about things only her son would know, describing the house and his childhood with terrifying, intimate detail. He told her that he had been taken, that he was still alive, but that he could not stay. He said he was being watched and that coming to her was a massive risk. They talked for over an hour, a mother and a son who had become strangers, separated by a decade and a half of trauma. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he walked back out into the night and vanished again. The police questioned her story, but Noreen never wavered. She knew her son was out there. To this day, the case of Johnny Gosh remains officially unsolved. Whether the man at the door was truly Johnny or a cruel imposter remains one of the greatest mysteries in the history of Iowa. The red wagon is gone, the newspapers are yellowed with age, but the image of the boy on the milk carton remains a symbol of an era where parents realized that the monsters were not under the bed, but waiting on the very street corners where their children played. The story of Johnny Gosh changed the way America looked at its children. It led to the creation of the first laws focused on missing persons and the realization that a child could vanish in the time it takes to walk a single block. It was a loss of innocence for an entire state. But while Iowa was grappling with the ghost of a paperboy 1,500 miles to the southwest, a young girl in New Mexico was about to answer a knock on her own door. The high desert of New Mexico carries its own kind of silence, a vastness that can hide a secret for an eternity. In the city of Gallup, the heat of the day lingers long after the sun goes down, turning the night into a shimmering, uncertain landscape. Antoinette Cayetito was 9 years old, and like Johnny, she believed that a knock at the door was something to be answered, unaware that on the other side of the wood, a different kind of darkness was waiting to enter. Story 5. The Midnight Knock, Antoinette Cayetito, 1986. The night in Gallup, New Mexico, in April of 1986, was not like the nights in the Midwest. It didn't feel heavy or humid. It was crisp, thin, and carried the scent of sagebrush and dry earth. If you stood outside the small house on South 5th Street at 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence was absolute. The stars were so bright they looked like holes punched in a black velvet curtain, but down on the ground, the shadows were deep and cold. Inside the house, the air was still, broken only by the soft, rhythmic breathing of 3 young girls sleeping in the same bedroom. There was no wind to rattle the window panes or whistle through the eaves. Just a profound, heavy quiet that seemed to settle over the furniture like a layer of dust. In that darkness, every tiny sound should have been magnified. Every floorboard creak should have sounded like a gunshot. But that night, the house was holding its breath. Antoinette Cayedito was 9 years old and was the kind of girl who possessed a wisdom far beyond her age. She was the eldest of 3 sisters, and she took her role as the protector very seriously. She was observant, quiet, and had a smile that felt like a secret she was sharing only with you. Antoinette loved her family fiercely, and in the small, tight-knit community of Gallup, she was known as a child who followed the rules and never looked for trouble. Her mother, Penny Cayedito, was a single parent working hard to give her girls a stable life. Their home was modest, filled with the sounds of laughter and the typical chaos of 3 children, but Penny made sure it was a fortress of safety. The girls knew never to talk to strangers and to always check with their mom before doing anything. Safety wasn't just a concept in the Cayedito household, it was a daily practice, a shield against the unpredictable world. The evening of April 5th had been entirely ordinary. Penny had taken the girls out for dinner at a local pizza place as a weekend treat. They had laughed over greasy slices and soda, the kind of simple family night that feels permanent and unbreakable. When they returned home, they went through the same routine they had followed hundreds of times before. They brushed their teeth, put on their pajamas, and climbed into their shared bed in the back of the house. Penny walked through the house, checking the locks on the front and back doors, a habit she never skipped. She made sure the windows were latched and the porch light was shining brightly on the desert sand. She kissed each of her daughters on the forehead, whispering goodnight, and went to her own room. By midnight, the house was a pocket of warmth and security in the vast, dark expanse of New Mexico. The routine was complete, the world was at rest. The hours passed in a long, unbroken stretch of mundane peace. The refrigerator hummed in the kitchen, its mechanical cycle the only pulse in the house. The girls shifted in their sleep, dreaming of school and friends and the next day's adventures. There was no reason to believe that this night was any different from the thousands that had come before it. It was the kind of deep, restorative sleep that only children can truly experience in a home they trust. Somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning, the silence was suddenly fractured. It wasn't a loud noise, not a crash or a scream. It was a rhythmic, deliberate sound coming from the front of the house. 3 sharp raps against the wooden frame of the front door. Cock, cock, cock. The sound vibrated through the hallway, reaching the bedroom where the girls lay. In the stillness of the early morning, it felt intrusive, like a foreign object piercing a bubble. The subtle shift happened when Antoinette's eyes snapped open. She didn't wake up slowly or groggily. She was instantly alert, her ears straining to identify the source of the noise. She sat up in bed, her heart beginning to drum a fast, nervous rhythm against her ribs. She looked at her younger sisters, who were still fast asleep, oblivious to the world. Why was someone at the door at this hour? It was a question that didn't fit into the logic of her 9-year-old life. She climbed out of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold linoleum floor. She didn't call out for her mother, perhaps because she didn't want to wake the house for what might be a mistake. She walked down the long, dark hallway, her shadow stretching out behind her. The front door loomed at the end of the hall, a heavy slab of wood that separated the warmth of her family from the cold desert night. She reached the door and stood there, listening to her own breath. Antoinette leaned her head against the wood, her skin prickling with a sudden, intense chill. From the other side, she heard a voice. It was low, muffled by the door, but it sounded familiar. The person outside claimed to be her Uncle Joe. He said he had an emergency and needed to come in. Antoinette hesitated. Her mother had told her never to open the door, but this was family. This was her uncle. The rules felt different when it was someone you loved. Imagine you are standing in that dark hallway. You are 9 years old. You hear a voice you think you recognize, pleading for help in the middle of the night. Do you walk back to your mother's room and wake her up? Or do you trust your ears and reach for the deadbolt? Because Antoinette was a girl who wanted to help, a girl who believed in the safety of her family. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and turned the cold metal of the lock until it clicked. The moment the door opened, the immersive reality of the night shifted from a dream into a nightmare. As the door swung wide, Antoinette didn't see her Uncle Joe. Instead, 2 large men reached into the warm air of the house and grabbed her. She didn't have time to scream before a hand was clamped over her mouth. Her younger sister, Sadie, had woken up and was watching from the end of the hallway, frozen in terror as she saw her sister being pulled away. Sadie watched as Antoinette struggled, her small legs kicking against the grip of the intruders. She saw the men carry her sister toward a brown van that was idling at the curb, its engine a low, menacing growl in the darkness. The door of the van slid shut with a heavy, final thud, and the vehicle sped off into the desert, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust and the sound of Sadie's belated screams echoing through the now empty and violated house. The police investigation was immediate and intense, but it hit a wall of silence. The real Uncle Joe had been home in bed and had nothing to do with the disappearance. The men had used his name because they knew it would work. They had been watching the house. They knew the family. For an entire year, there were no leads, no clues, and no sign of Antoinette. Penny Cayadito lived in a state of perpetual mourning, her life centered on a phone that never rang. The bizarre reveal happened exactly 1 year later. In April of 1987, a dispatcher at the Gallup Police Department received a frantic phone call. A young girl's voice, high-pitched and terrified, came over the line. She said, "My name is Antoinette Cayadito, and I am in Albuquerque." Before she could say anything else, a man's voice barked in the background, asking who she was talking to. There was a scuffle, a scream, and then the line went dead. Police traced the call to a payphone at a convenience store, but by the time they arrived, the area was deserted. Later that same year, a waitress at a diner in Carson City, Nevada, reported seeing a girl who looked exactly like Antoinette. The girl was sitting with a man and woman who seemed very controlling. The girl had scribbled something on a napkin and left it under her plate. When the waitress found it, it simply said, "Please help me, call the police." Despite these chilling glimpses, Antoinette Cayadito was never found. The brown van, the men who knew her uncle's name, and the person who cut off her phone call remained shadows in the desert. The case left a permanent scar on the community of Gallup, a reminder that the most dangerous thing you can do is answer a knock in the night. Penny Cayadito passed away in 1999, her heart broken by a mystery that she could never hope to solve. The story of Antoinette is a haunting example of how a single decision, made with the best of intentions, can lead to a lifetime of darkness. She was a protector who tried to help her family, and in doing so, she was taken from them forever. The desert of New Mexico kept its secret, just as it would for many others. But while the search for Antoinette was slowly fading into a cold case, another young woman in the same state was about to go for a morning ride. Tara Calico was 19, a vibrant college student who felt invincible in the bright sun of New Mexico. She didn't fear the quiet roads or the vast stretches of highway. She believed that as long as she stayed moving, she was safe. But as she pedaled her bicycle down Highway 47, she had no idea that a different kind of predator was following her and that a single piece of discarded film would soon become one of the most haunting images in history. Story 6. The Polaroid in the Parking Lot. Tara Calico, 1988. The sun in New Mexico during the month of September is relentless and unforgiving. It beats down on the high desert with a white intensity that makes the horizon shimmer and dance in the heat. On the morning of September 20th, 1988, the air in Valencia County was bone dry, carrying only the faint scent of baked earth and scorched creosote bushes. If you were standing on the edge of Highway 47, you would hear a single, steady sound. It was the rhythmic, metallic clicking of a bicycle chain moving at a high speed. It was a clean, mechanical sound that repeated over and over, cutting through the heavy silence of the desert. The tires of the bike hissed as they rolled over the hot asphalt, a sound like a long, drawn-out whisper. This was the sound of a routine, a sound of discipline, and a sound of absolute normalcy. It was a sound that belonged to the morning, until it suddenly stopped. Tara Calico was 19 years old and was the kind of person who radiated energy and purpose. She was a sophomore at the University of New Mexico, a straight-A student who worked at a local bank and lived life at a full sprint. Tara was athletic, disciplined, and possessed a vibrant personality that made her the center of attention in any room. She had a close, unbreakable bond with her mother, Patty Dole, and they shared almost everything about their lives. To the people in the town of Ballen, Tara was the girl who was always on the move. She was the one you would see jogging in the early hours or cycling miles down the highway before most people had even finished their first cup of coffee. She was incredibly reliable and never missed an appointment or a shift at work. Her life was a series of well-planned goals, and she was checking them off one by one. She felt like she owned the road she traveled on every day. The process of her morning ride was a clockwork operation. Every morning at precisely 9:30, Tara would prepare for her 36-mile bike ride. She would start by checking the air pressure in the tires of her neon-colored mountain bike, pressing her thumb into the rubber to ensure it was firm. She would then adjust the seat height, a tiny calibration she did every single time. It was a ritual of safety and performance that she never, ever skipped. She would then grab her Sony Walkman, a device that was her constant companion on these long, solitary journeys. She would carefully select a cassette tape that morning, it was a band called Boston, and slide it into the player. She would click the plastic door shut, put on her yellow headphones, and clip the Walkman to the waistband of her shorts. The music would start, a wall of sound that blocked out the rest of the world and let her focus on the pedals. Tara would then walk her bike out to the driveway, stretching her calves and quads against the warm brick of the house. She would tell her mother, Patty, that she would be back by noon for their planned lunch. Patty, who usually rode with her but was feeling tired that morning, told her to be careful. Tara just laughed, told her mother she loved her, and pushed off into the street. She began the steady climb toward Highway 47, her legs moving in a blur. Once she reached the highway, the world opened up into a vast, empty stretch of asphalt. To her right were the Manzano Mountains, purple and jagged against the blue sky. To her left was the endless desert. She settled into her rhythm, the music in her ears, and the wind on her face. She would pass the same landmarks every day: the rusted fence at mile marker 5, the abandoned gas station, and the lonely telephone pole where a hawk usually sat and watched. The mundane stretch of her ride was her favorite part of the day. She loved the feeling of her lungs burning and the sweat dripping down the back of her neck. She would count her breaths, matching them to the beat of the music. 1, 2, 3, push. 1, 2, 3, push. She was in a meditative state, a pocket of intense physical effort in the middle of a silent landscape. She had done this route hundreds of times. She knew every dip and every crack in the road. She reached the halfway point of her ride around 10:30 in the morning. She turned the bike around and began the journey back toward Ballen. The wind was now at her back, making the ride feel effortless. She was flying, her tires barely touching the ground as she sped past the mile markers. She was thinking about lunch, about her classes, and about the weekend ahead. She felt completely safe, completely in control of her environment and her future. The subtle shift happened when a white pickup truck, an older model with a camper shell, began to follow her. It didn't pass her like the other vehicles. It stayed about 50 yards behind, its engine a low, distant hum that she could barely hear over her music. A witness who was driving in the opposite direction noticed the truck and noticed Tara. To the witness, it looked like a father following his daughter to make sure she was safe. It didn't look like a hunt. Tara didn't seem to notice the truck at first. She was focused on the road ahead, her yellow headphones clamped tight over her ears. But as the truck began to close the distance, she might have seen the reflection in her small handlebar mirror. The truck wasn't slowing down for the upcoming turn, it was accelerating. The white paint was chipped and dusty, and the driver was a shadow behind the glare of the windshield. The silence of the desert felt heavier now. Your heart rate starts to climb, but it is not from the exercise anymore. It is from a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline that hits your stomach like lead. You are on a highway where you can see for miles, yet you feel like you are in a tiny, shrinking room. The sound of the engine behind you is getting louder, drowning out the guitar solo in your headphones. You push the pedals harder, your muscles screaming, but you know a bicycle cannot outrun a ton of steel. You look for a house, a car, another human being, but the desert is indifferent. You have a choice. Do you swerve off the road into the soft sand and hope they pass? Or do you stay on the asphalt and keep racing toward a town that is still miles away? Tara made her choice, but it didn't matter. The truck didn't just follow her, it lunged. The sound of the music stopped as the Walkman was ripped from her waist, and the highway returned to its absolute silence. When noon came and went, Patty Dole began to worry. She drove out onto the highway, scanning the shoulders for the neon bike. She found nothing. By that evening, the police had found the first clue, Tara's Sony Walkman. It was lying in the dirt near the road, the Boston cassette tape still inside, but the plastic case shattered. A few feet away, they found a trail of scuff marks in the sand and the tire tracks of a vehicle that had accelerated away very quickly. Tara Calico and her bicycle were gone. Despite a massive search involving hundreds of people and the FBI, no sign of her was found for months. The desert seemed to have swallowed her whole, leaving Patty and her family in a state of agonizing limbo. They received hundreds of tips, but each one led to a dead end. The vibrant, athletic girl who lived life at a sprint had been stopped in her tracks, and the town of Ballen was left haunted by her absence. The bizarre reveal happened almost a year later, in June of 1989, 1,500 miles away in Port St. Joe, Florida. A woman walking into a grocery store found a Polaroid photograph lying face down in a parking lot. When she turned it over, she gasped. The photo showed a young woman and a young boy, both bound and gagged with duct tape, lying on a pile of blankets in the back of a van. They looked terrified, their eyes wide with a silent plea. Patty Dole was certain the girl in the photo was Tara. She pointed to a scar on the girl's leg that was identical to one Tara had from a car accident. The boy in the photo was thought to be Michael Henley, another child who had gone missing in New Mexico around the same time. The Polaroid became one of the most famous and haunting pieces of evidence in criminal history. It suggested a level of organized cruelty that was far worse than anyone had imagined. However, the mystery only deepened. Forensic experts at the FBI were split on whether the girl was truly Tara. Years later, Michael Henley's remains were found in the mountains where he had disappeared, suggesting he had died of exposure and was not the boy in the photo. If the boy wasn't Michael, was the girl really Tara? The Polaroid offered a glimpse into a world of darkness, but it provided no map to where that world was located or how to get the victims back. The story of Tara Calico remains a gaping wound in the history of New Mexico. Patty Dole moved to Florida, near where the photo was found, and spent the rest of her life looking for her daughter. She passed away in 2006 without ever knowing the truth. The white truck, the broken Walkman, and the silent girl in the photograph remain as the only remnants of a morning ride that never ended, a journey that led into a mystery with no resolution. Tara's story is a reminder that the paths we know best can become the most unfamiliar in an instant. She was a girl of routine and strength, yet she vanished from a wide-open highway in broad daylight. Her bicycle was never recovered, a piece of metal that should have been easy to find but instead disappeared into the void. But as the desert air of New Mexico carried the memory of Tara, a different kind of silence was settling over a ball field in Arkansas. The sound of a baseball hitting a mitt is a sound of summer, of safety, and of small-town life. But for a mother named Colleen Nick, that sound would forever be associated with the moment her world stopped. While New Mexico searched for a girl on a bike, a 6-year-old named Morgan was about to chase a lightning bug into the shadows of a parking lot, leaving behind only a pair of small shoes and a mystery that would change a state forever. Story 7. The Lightning Bug Trap. Morgan Nick, 1995. The humid night air in Alma, Arkansas on June 9, 1995 felt like a warm, wet blanket pressed against your skin. It was the kind of evening where the air is so thick you can almost taste the dust from the baseball diamond and the sweet, heavy scent of wild honeysuckle growing near the fences. If you were standing at the edge of the parking lot at the Alma Little League complex, the world would have sounded like a symphony of summer life. You would hear the rhythmic, hollow ping of aluminum bats connecting with softballs, followed by the roar of parents cheering from the bleachers. There was the constant, low-frequency hum of cicadas in the nearby oak trees, a sound that seemed to vibrate in your very bones. And beneath it all, the soft, high-pitched giggles of children playing in the dirt, their small voices rising and falling like the flickering lights of the lightning bugs dancing in the shadows. Morgan Nick was 6 years old, and she was the kind of child who seemed to be made of pure sunshine. She had a mop of white blonde hair that caught the light even in the dimming twilight, and a pair of sparkling blue eyes that always seemed to be looking for the next adventure. Morgan was social, fearless, and possessed a laugh that was so infectious it could make a stranger stop and smile. To her mother, Colleen Nick, Morgan was the center of the entire universe. Colleen was a protective mother, the kind who always kept one eye on her kids, even when she was talking to friends. But that night, in the small town of Alma, the world felt incredibly safe. It was a community where everyone knew everyone else's name, and where the local ball field was considered an extension of everyone's backyard. There were hundreds of people around, all focused on the game, all sharing in the same peaceful, suburban Friday night ritual. The process of the evening was a slow, comfortable stretch of time. The game had started around 7 o'clock, and the children had quickly formed their own little tribe. Morgan and two of her friends had found a massive pile of sand near the parking lot just a few yards away from where Colleen was sitting in the bleachers. It was a perfect playground. The kids were busy building castles and digging holes, their small hands covered in the gray, gritty Arkansas dirt. Every few minutes, Colleen would glance over her shoulder. She would see that familiar tuft of blonde hair bobbing up and down in the sand. She would see Morgan running back and forth, chasing the lightning bugs that were beginning to emerge from the tall grass at the edge of the woods. The routine was steady. Watch the game, cheer for a hit, look back at the sand pile, see the blonde hair, repeat. It was a cycle of normalcy that felt entirely unbreakable. As the clock ticked toward 10:45, the final inning of the game was winding down. The crowd began to stir, gathering their lawn chairs and coolers. The children in the sand pile were getting tired, their movements slowing down as the excitement of the night began to fade. Colleen watched as the two other children started to walk back toward their parents. Morgan was still there, leaning over to knock the sand out of her little white sneakers. She was just finishing up a mundane task that every kid does 1,000 times. She was standing right next to the parking lot, under the glow of a single buzzing street lamp. Colleen looked back one more time, saw Morgan shaking her shoes, and then turned to say a quick goodbye to a friend. It was a conversation that lasted no more than 30 seconds. Just long enough to exchange a few words about the next game and promise to call over the weekend. The subtle shift happened when Colleen turned back toward the sand pile. The pile was still there, a gray mound in the darkness. The two other children were already with their parents. But the spot where Morgan had been standing, right under that street lamp, was now empty. There was no blonde hair. There was no sound of a child running. The space was just a void, a hole in the night, where a 6-year-old girl had been standing only a few heartbeats before. At first, Colleen didn't panic. She figured Morgan had simply walked to their car, a silver Nissan Quest parked just a few dozen feet away. She walked toward the car, her keys jingling in her hand. She expected to see Morgan leaning against the door, maybe even pouting about having to leave the game. But as the car came into view, the sidewalk was bare. She looked under the vehicle, thinking maybe Morgan was playing a game of hide-and-seek. Nothing. The cold realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. Your heart doesn't just speed up. It feels like it has stopped entirely, replaced by a heavy, cold stone. You call her name, softly at first, because you don't want to cause a scene. Morgan? Morgan, honey? But the only answer is the sound of car doors slamming and engines starting as the other families begin to leave. You realize that the crowd, which felt like a shield, is now a wall of static. You start to run. You run back to the sand pile, your breath coming in jagged, painful gasps. You ask the other kids if they saw where Morgan went. They point toward the parking lot and mention a man in a red truck with a white camper shell. They say he was talking to her. You look at the exit of the parking lot, but all you see are taillights disappearing into the darkness. You are standing in a sea of people, yet you have never felt more alone in your life. The interrogation of the night began. Why did you look away? Why did you let her stay at the sand pile for those last few minutes? These are the questions that would haunt Colleen for the next 30 years. Because here's the thing about safety. It is an illusion we all buy into until the moment it is shattered. You think you are in a fortress, but the fortress has no walls. The predator wasn't hiding in the woods. He was sitting in the parking lot watching. The search for Morgan Nick was one of the most intensive in the history of the state. Thousands of people joined the police and the FBI, searching every inch of the Ozark National Forest and the surrounding counties. They checked every red truck in a 3-state radius, but Morgan was gone. The only things left behind were those 2 little white sneakers, still sitting near the sand pile, filled with the grit of a game that Morgan never got to finish. The bizarre reveal didn't come until 26 years later, in 2021. Investigators had long suspected a man named Billy Jack Lynx, a local man who had attempted to kidnap another girl just months after Morgan disappeared. Lynx had died in prison in 2000, taking his secrets with him. But modern technology finally caught up. DNA testing was performed on a piece of evidence found in Lynx's old truck, which had been sitting in a junkyard. The test results were a devastating confirmation. A hair found in the seat of that red truck belonged to Morgan Nick. It wasn't a sighting, and it wasn't a recovery, but it was the first solid piece of physical evidence in a quarter of a century. It proved that Morgan had been in that vehicle, confirming the nightmare that Colleen had lived every single day. The man who had been watching the lightning bugs wasn't there to admire the lights. He was waiting for the moment. Colleen Nick never gave up. She founded the Morgan Nick Foundation, which has helped recover hundreds of other missing children and has changed the way the entire country handles child abductions. She turned her grief into a weapon, a shield for every other parent in America. But the hole in her own heart remains. Every June 9th, she returns to that ball field in Alma, standing in the silence, waiting for a little girl with blonde hair who never came home. The story of Morgan Nick is a reminder that the most ordinary moments can be the most dangerous. A game of baseball, a pile of sand, and a jar of lightning bugs, these are the building blocks of a perfect childhood, but they are also the stage for an unspeakable tragedy. Morgan's disappearance changed the laws of Arkansas and the hearts of everyone who heard her name. But while Arkansas was searching for Morgan, the state of Texas was about to face its own ghost. In the city of Arlington, only a few hours away, another young girl was getting ready to ride her bike. Her name was Amber Hagerman, and like Morgan, she believed the neighborhood streets were her playground. The summer heat of Texas was just as heavy as the Arkansas humidity, and the silence that followed her disappearance would lead to a system that now rings out on every phone in the country, a legacy born from a tragedy that a mother could never forget. Story 8. Amber's last ride, Amber Hagerman, 1996. The heat in Arlington, Texas in January is not supposed to be oppressive, but on the 13th of January, 1996, the air was unusually thick. It carried the heavy, metallic scent of asphalt and the dry, dusty smell of dead winter grass. If you stood in the middle of the empty Winn-Dixie parking lot on Abram Street, the only thing you would hear was the rhythmic, hollow clicking of bicycle tires spinning against the cracked pavement. It was a lonely sound. The sound was punctuated by the occasional distant hum of a car engine from the main road, but mostly it was just that hiss of rubber on concrete. The sunlight was flat and gray, reflecting off the boarded-up windows of the old grocery store. It felt like a place where time had decided to stop. A concrete island where the only movement was two young children circling on their bikes, their laughter sounding thin and fragile in the vast, open silence of the lot. Amber Hagerman was 9 years old, and she was the kind of girl who possessed a spirit that was much larger than her small frame. She had a mop of dark hair and a smile that could light up a room, even on the gloomiest Texas afternoon. Amber was full of energy, always the first to suggest a race or a game, and she had a protective nature when it came to her younger brother, Ricky. To Amber, the world was a playground, and every street was an invitation for a new adventure. Her mother, Donna Whitson, was a woman who worked tirelessly to provide a loving home for her children. They lived in a modest house on Abram Street, a place where the neighbors looked out for one another and kids played outside until the street lamps flickered on. Amber was a girl of routine and reliability. She knew exactly where the boundaries were, and she knew that as long as she stayed within sight of the neighborhood landmarks, she was safe. She was a beacon of joy. The process of the afternoon began around 3 o'clock. Amber and 5-year-old Ricky were restless, the kind of energy that only kids on a weekend can have. They begged their mother to let them ride their bikes. Donna hesitated, looking at the gray sky, but eventually gave in. The rule was simple. Stay on the block, do not go far, and stay together. Amber promised, her eyes bright with the thrill of the ride. She grabbed her pink bicycle, and they headed out. The mundane stretch of their ride was a series of slow, deliberate loops. They started at their front door, pedaling down the driveway and onto the sidewalk. Amber led the way, her legs moving in a steady rhythm, while Ricky struggled to keep up on his smaller bike. They passed the familiar houses with their brown lawns and the oak trees that were bare for the winter. Each revolution of the pedals took them further away from the porch, further into the freedom of the street. They decided to head toward the abandoned Winn-Dixie grocery store. It was only 2 blocks away, a massive expanse of asphalt that was perfect for doing tricks and racing. Amber loved the way her bike felt on the open pavement, the wind whipping through her hair. She would stand up on the pedals, pushing herself to go faster and faster, her shadow stretching out behind her like a long, dark ribbon. Ricky followed her, his small tires humming a lower, slower tune. They reached the parking lot and began their ritual. They would race from one end of the lot to the loading dock, then turn around and do it again. Amber would give Ricky a head start, then easily overtake him, laughing as she zipped past. They spent nearly 20 minutes in that lot, a mundane exercise in childhood joy. The clicking of the bikes was constant, a steady pulse in the quiet afternoon. They were just two kids on a Saturday, doing exactly what kids do. The subtle shift happened when Ricky started to feel a little uneasy. He didn't know why, but the empty parking lot suddenly felt too big, too quiet. He told Amber he wanted to go home. Amber, always the leader, teased him for a second, but then agreed. She told him to head back and that she would do just one more lap around the loading dock. Ricky turned his bike toward their house and began to pedal away. He didn't look back. He assumed she was right behind him. But as Ricky reached the edge of the lot, a black pickup truck pulled in from the street. It didn't belong there. It wasn't one of the neighbors' vehicles. It was an older model, dark and dusty, and it moved with a strange, predatory smoothness. It didn't slow down for the speed bumps. It headed straight for the back of the building, toward the loading dock where Amber was finishing her final lap. The clicking of her pink bike was about to be silenced by a much louder sound. Imagine you are standing on your own street in a neighborhood you have lived in your entire life. You are 9 years old, and you are only 2 blocks from your mother. You see a car pull up, and for a second, you think someone is just lost. You think they are going to ask for directions. You have no reason to run. You have no reason to scream. Why would you? This is your home. These are your streets. But what happens when the person in the car isn't lost? What happens when the familiar landscape of your childhood becomes a hunting ground? Amber didn't have time to process the danger. A man jumped out of the truck, his movements fast and violent. He grabbed her off her bike, his hands cold and strong. She kicked and she screamed, a high-pitched, terrifying sound that tore through the quiet of the afternoon. A neighbor, 78-year-old Jim Kevel, saw it from his backyard. He saw the struggle. He saw the horror. He shouted for the man to let her go, but it was too late. The man threw Amber into the cab of the truck like she was nothing more than a bag of groceries. The door slammed shut with a heavy, metallic thud. The tires of the black truck screeched against the asphalt, leaving behind a trail of blue smoke and the smell of burnt rubber. The truck sped away, turning the corner and vanishing into the maze of Arlington streets. Amber's pink bike was left lying in the dirt. When Ricky got home and realized Amber wasn't there, the panic in the Hagerman household was instantaneous. Donna ran to the parking lot, her heart hammering against her ribs. She found the bike, its front wheel still spinning slowly, but her daughter was gone. The police arrived within minutes, and the entire city of Arlington mobilized. They searched every apartment complex, every park, and every abandoned building. They put out a description of the black truck. But despite a witness and a fast response, the trail went cold almost immediately. For 4 days, the world held its breath. People prayed in the streets. They put up posters on every telephone pole. The mystery wasn't just where she was, but how someone could be so brazen in broad daylight. The bizarre reveal came 4 days later, when a man walking his dog near a storm-swollen creek 4 miles away looked down into the water and saw something that broke the city's heart. It was Amber. She had been found in the Forest Hill apartment complex, her body discarded in a cold, shallow creek. The autopsy revealed a level of cruelty that the police refused to fully disclose to the public. But the most baffling part was that despite the description of the truck and the man, and despite thousands of tips, the killer was never found. He had vanished into the Texas landscape as if he had never existed at all, leaving behind only a legacy of pain. The tragedy of Amber Hagerman changed the world forever. Her murder was the catalyst for the creation of the Amber Alert System, a technology that now sends emergency notifications to millions of phones the second a child goes missing. It has saved thousands of lives, turning a local tragedy into a global shield for children. But for Donna Whitson, the system is a constant, bitter reminder of the one girl it could not save. The killer remains a ghost in the machine. The story of Amber is a reminder that out of the darkest moments, a light can sometimes emerge. Her name is now spoken every time a child is in danger, a silent sentinel standing guard over the neighborhoods of America. But while Texas was learning to watch the roads for black trucks, a different kind of silence was settling over the suburbs of Arizona. The desert heat was just as intense, and the sound of a mechanical melody was about to lead another girl into the dark. In the city of Mesa, Mikkel Biggs was 11 years old and had a very simple craving for something sweet. She stood on the corner of her street, her bicycle tires spinning just like Amber's had, waiting for the familiar jingle of the ice cream truck. She thought she was safe because she was within sight of her own front door. But in the time it took for her sister to walk inside and grab a jacket, Mikkel would disappear, leaving behind only a bike and a mystery. Story 9. The Ice Cream Truck, Mikkel Biggs, 1999. The music of an ice cream truck is supposed to be a sound of pure joy. It is a siren song for children, a tinny electronic melody that cuts through the stagnant air of a suburban afternoon. In Mesa, Arizona, on January 2nd, 1999, that music sounded like a glitch in the universe. It was an artificial, high-pitched jingle that repeated the same 12 notes over and over again, echoing off the stucco walls of the houses on Kimberly Way. It was a sound that promised sugar and laughter, but that evening, it became the background noise for a disappearance that would baffle the nation for decades. The air in Mesa was cooling down as the sun began to dip behind the flat horizon, carrying the scent of dry desert dust and the faint, sweet smell of orange blossoms from a nearby grove. If you stood on the corner, you could hear the distant hum of traffic on the freeway, a constant pulse of life. Mikkel Biggs was 11 years old and was the kind of girl who felt like the heart of her neighborhood. She was an honor student, a talented clarinet player, and a protective older sister to her 9-year-old sister, Kimber. Mikkel was vibrant, responsible, and possessed a level of maturity that made her parents, Darian and Tracy, trust her implicitly. She was the kind of kid who followed the rules, not because she had to, but because she valued them. To the people on Kimberly Way, the Biggs family was the gold standard of suburban life. Their house was always full of music and the sound of children playing in the cul-de-sac. Mikkel was a fixture in the community, often seen riding her favorite orange bicycle with the white tassels on the handlebars. She had a bright future ahead of her, one filled with music and academic achievements, and she walked through the world with a sense of quiet confidence. The process of the evening began around 5 o'clock. The holiday season was just winding down, and the kids were enjoying the last few days of winter break. Mikkel and Kimber were outside, enjoying the mild Arizona winter weather. They were waiting for the arrival of the neighborhood ice cream truck, a ritual that happened almost every day at that exact time. They had their coins clutched in their hands, their eyes scanning the end of the long street. They could hear the jingle from blocks away, a faint, metallic version of the entertainer that grew louder with every passing minute. It was a slow, agonizing wait for an 11-year-old. They stood on the sidewalk, their shadows growing long and thin on the pavement. Mikkel was leaning on her orange bike, the white tassels swaying slightly in the breeze. They talked about which ice cream they were going to get, a mundane debate over chocolate or vanilla. The wait stretched on as the truck seemed to take a detour down a neighboring block. The sisters decided to move toward the corner to get a better vantage point. The sound of the music was getting closer now, the vibrations of the speakers making the air feel thick and heavy. Mikkel began to pedal in small, slow circles on the asphalt, her eyes fixed on the turn at the end of the road. Kimber followed her on foot, her small hand clutching her quarters. The sun was now a deep orange ball, casting a golden light over everything. The neighborhood felt peaceful, a pocket of safety where the only concern was whether the ice cream truck would run out of firecracker popsicles. Mikkel continued her slow, rhythmic circling, the clicking of her bike chain, the only other sound besides the distant jingle. It was a moment of pure, uncomplicated childhood anticipation, a routine they had followed 100 times before. The subtle shift happened around 5:45. The air had taken on a sudden, sharp chill as the desert heat evaporated. Kimber, who was only wearing a thin t-shirt, began to shiver. She looked at Mikkel and said she was going to run inside for just a second to grab a jacket. Mikkel nodded, her eyes still on the road. She told Kimber she would stay right there on the corner to make sure they didn't miss the truck. It was a 90-second decision. Kimber turned and ran toward their front door, her sneakers slapping against the driveway. She burst into the house, grabbed her favorite sweatshirt from the hook in the hallway, and turned right back around. She wasn't even inside long enough for the door to finish swinging shut. She was focused on getting back to her sister and that ice cream. But as she stepped back onto the porch and looked toward the corner, the world had changed in a way she couldn't understand. The immersive reality of the street was now one of absolute, terrifying silence. The ice cream truck music was gone. The street was empty. Kimber walked down the driveway, her heart starting to race. She called out Mikkel's name, her voice sounding small and fragile in the twilight. There was no answer. She reached the corner where her sister had been pedaling only moments ago. The space was vacant, but something was lying in the middle of the road. It was Mikkel's orange bicycle. It wasn't leaned up against a tree or parked neatly on the sidewalk. It was lying on its side in the dirt, the white tassels stained with dust. And the most haunting detail was the rear wheel. It was still spinning. It was turning slowly, a silent mechanical witness to whatever had just occurred. A few feet away, Mikkel's quarters were scattered in the street, glowing like silver eyes in the fading light of the desert sun. You have to ask yourself, how much can happen in 90 seconds? It is the time it takes to boil a cup of water or tie your shoes. To Kimber, it was just a blink. But in that tiny window of time, a predator had moved with a speed and precision that was almost supernatural. There were no screams, there were no sounds of a struggle, there were no tire marks. Mikkel had simply been erased from the corner of her own street while her sister was 5 yards away. The search for Mikkel Biggs was the largest in the history of Mesa. The police interviewed every resident on the block, searched every garage, and tracked down every ice cream truck driver in the state. They looked into a neighbor named D. Blaylock, a man with a dark history who lived just a few houses away, but they could never find the evidence to link him to the crime. For years, the orange bike sat in evidence, a relic of a girl who had vanished into thin air. The bizarre reveal didn't come until 19 years later in 2018. A man in the small town of Neenah, Wisconsin, over 1,500 miles away from Mesa, was looking at a $1 bill he had received as change. He noticed something written in the margin in small, cramped handwriting. It said, "My name is Mikkel Biggs. I was kidnapped from Mesa, Arizona. I am still alive." The message felt like a ghost reaching out from the past. The police in Wisconsin and Arizona immediately launched an investigation into the dollar bill. They analyzed the ink and the handwriting, trying to determine if it could truly be from Mikkel. But a $1 bill travels through thousands of hands every year. It was impossible to know when it was written or where it had come from. Was it a genuine plea for help from a woman who had been held captive for 2 decades? Or was it a cruel prank by someone who knew the story? The investigation into the note eventually went cold, just like the original case. Mikkel Biggs has never been found, and her disappearance remains a haunting mystery that defines the city of Mesa. Her family still holds vigils, and Kimber, now a grown woman, still lives with the weight of those 90 seconds. The spinning wheel of the orange bike is an image that has become a permanent part of the local lore, a symbol of a life interrupted by the dark. The story of Mikkel Biggs is a reminder that the world can change in the time it takes to grab a jacket. She was an honor student and a protector, yet she was taken from the very spot where she felt most secure. The silence of the Arizona desert kept it secret, a mystery that spanned 2 decades and 2,000 miles. But as the millennium came to a close, another young girl in a different part of the country was about to make a choice that defied all logic. In the small town of Shelby, North Carolina, the year 2000 was just beginning. The air was not dry and dusty like Arizona, but wet and heavy with the coming of a massive winter storm. Asha Degree was 9 years old, and like Mikkel, she was a girl of routine and discipline. But on a night when most people were huddling inside to escape the wind and the rain, Asha would do something that no one saw coming, leading into the most baffling case of them all. Story 10. The Rainstorm Walk Asha Degree, 2000. The rain in Shelby, North Carolina, on the night of February 14th, 2000, was not a gentle southern mist. It was a cold, violent downpour that felt like 1,000 tiny needles striking the earth. If you were standing outside on Highway 18 at 4 o'clock in the morning, the world would have felt like a drowning place. The wind was a low, mournful howl that rattled the bare branches of the oak trees and whipped the rain into a frenzy. The air carried the sharp, metallic tang of wet asphalt and the heavy, thick scent of soaked red clay. The only light came from the occasional flash of distant lightning, illuminating the rolling hills for a split second before plunging everything back into a deep, suffocating darkness. In that darkness, the sound of the storm was absolute, a chaotic roar that drowned out every other noise. It was a night when every living thing should have been seeking shelter. Asha Degree was 9 years old and was the kind of girl who was the definition of a homebody. She was a star student at Falston Elementary, a talented point guard on her basketball team, and deeply involved in her local church. Asha was known for being incredibly shy, cautious, and intensely devoted to her family. She lived in a world of routine and safety, a world where the 4 walls of her house on Oakcrest Street were the boundaries of her entire universe. To her parents, Harold and Aquila Degree, Aisha was a dream child. She followed every rule, did her homework without being asked, and was so afraid of the dark that she wouldn't even walk to the kitchen at night without a light on. She was a child who valued order and predictability. Her life was filled with the sounds of her brother O'Brien's laughter and the comfort of a close-knit community where everyone looked out for one another. She felt completely safe. The process of that final evening began with a celebration of love and family. It was Valentine's Day, and it was also Harold and Aquila's wedding anniversary. The family had spent the day together, sharing a meal and laughing about the basketball game Asha had played earlier that afternoon. Even though her team had lost, Asha was in good spirits, her mind already moving on to the next challenge. The house was a warm, brightly lit sanctuary against the gray weather. The routine was as steady as a heartbeat. After dinner, the children did their homework at the kitchen table, the scratching of pencils, the only sound besides the rain on the roof. They watched a little television, then began the ritual of getting ready for bed. Asha brushed her teeth, put on her favorite white nightshirt with a large teddy bear on the front, and climbed into the bed she shared with O'Brien. Her father tucked them in, kissing them goodnight. Around 9 o'clock, the power in the neighborhood flickered and then went out entirely, a victim of the worsening storm. The house was plunged into that thick, heavy darkness that Asha feared so much. Harold went into the children's room to check on them, seeing their small forms huddled under the blankets. He felt a sense of peace, knowing his family was safe inside while the world outside was in chaos. He eventually went to sleep himself at 2:30. But inside that dark room, something was happening that defied everything everyone knew about Asha Degree. While the rest of the house slept, Asha was not dreaming. She was awake. Her mind focused on a plan that she had seemingly been preparing for days. She quietly climbed out of bed, her feet touching the cold floor. She didn't turn on a flashlight. She didn't call for her parents. She moved through the darkness with a chilling, silent purpose that was not hers. The subtle shift had actually begun a few days earlier. Her parents noticed she seemed a little more quiet than usual, but they attributed it to the loss of her basketball game. But that night, the shift became a physical reality. Asha went to her closet and grabbed her black book bag. She began to pack it with very specific items: her favorite Tweety Bird t-shirt, her basketball uniform, and a pair of blue jeans. These weren't the actions of a runaway child. These were the actions of someone preparing for an appointment. She dressed herself in a white t-shirt and white pants, a stark contrast to the black night. She put on her sneakers and laced them tight. She grabbed her bag and walked through the dark hallway, past her parents' bedroom, and out the front door. She stepped into the freezing rain and the howling wind, leaving behind the only safety she had ever known. She didn't look back as she began to walk. Asha began the trek from her house toward Highway 18. It was a journey of over a mile through residential streets before reaching the main road. The rain was so heavy she must have been soaked to the bone within minutes. The wind would have been pushing against her small frame, trying to knock her off her feet, but she kept moving. She walked past the neighbors' houses, past the church, and out into the open, unprotected stretch of the highway. Imagine you are 9 years old. You are terrified of the dark, and you are terrified of storms. Yet here you are, walking alone on a pitch-black highway in the middle of a gale. Why? What could possibly be powerful enough to pull you out of your warm bed and into that nightmare? Because the logic of a child is different from the logic of an adult. But even for a child, this made no sense. It was as if she were being led by a string that only she could see. The immersive reality of that walk was one of sensory overload and isolation. The sound of the rain against her hood would have been a constant drumbeat. The cold would have seeped into her joints, making every step an act of will. She wasn't running. She was walking with a steady, determined pace. A truck driver named Jeff Rupee later reported seeing her. He saw a small figure in white walking south on the shoulder of the road at 3:45 in the morning. He thought it was so strange that he actually turned his truck around and drove back to check on her. He pulled his massive rig onto the shoulder and called out to her, asking if she needed help. But as the headlights of the truck illuminated her, Aisha didn't stop. She didn't ask for a ride. Instead, she looked at the truck, then suddenly bolted off the road and into the dark woods that lined the highway. She vanished into the trees like a ghost in the rain. Another witness saw her a short time later near the same area. This was the last time anyone would ever see Asha Degree. When Aquila Degree went into the children's room at 6:30 that morning to wake them for school, she found O'Brien in the bed, but Asha's side was empty. The panic that followed was a tidal wave that hit the house and never truly receded. The police were called, and a search began that would eventually involve hundreds of federal agents. The interrogation of this case is the most difficult of all. There was no evidence of a break-in, no signs of a struggle. The door had been locked behind her. All the evidence pointed to the impossible. She had chosen to leave. You have to ask yourself, was she being groomed by someone? Had she been convinced that she was going on an adventure? Or was there something even darker, a reason for her to flee the home that everyone believed was her sanctuary? The bizarre reveal didn't come for 18 months. In August of 2001, a construction worker was clearing a site in Burke County over 26 miles away from where Asha was last seen. As the heavy machinery moved the earth, he saw something tucked away in a plastic bag near a creek. It was Asha's black book bag. It had been double wrapped in heavy-duty trash bags, as if someone wanted to preserve the contents for a very long time. Inside the bag were the clothes she had packed and a book from her school library. But there was also a t-shirt that didn't belong to Asha, a shirt with a picture of a band she didn't know. The bag had been buried deep in the ground, far away from any path she could have walked on her own. It was proof that Asha hadn't just disappeared, she had been taken. Someone had found her in that storm, or someone had been waiting for her to walk right into their hands. The mystery of Asha Degree remains one of the most haunting cold cases in the history of the South. Every year on February 14th, the Degree family leads a walk along Highway 18, retracing the steps their daughter took that night. They keep her room exactly as it was, the posters on the wall and the books on the shelf waiting for a girl who would now be a woman. They refuse to let the world forget the name of the girl who walked out into the rain. The story of Asha is a reminder that the greatest mysteries are often the ones that happen in the places we feel most secure. She was a girl of routine and fear, yet she conquered that fear to walk into a darkness that never gave her back. Her disappearance was the end of an era for Shelby, a loss of innocence that can never be recovered. But her memory remains a light, a silent call for answers that are buried somewhere in the red clay of North Carolina. That concludes our 10th story about the strange, the dark, and the mysterious disappearances that have left a permanent mark on history. These 10 cases, from the quiet streets of Cleveland to the rain-soaked highways of Shelby, remind us that the world is a much more unpredictable place than we like to admit. Every sidewalk, every bike ride, and every knock on the door carries a weight we often ignore until the moment the silence becomes permanent. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. These stories are not just about tragedy. They are about the resilience of the families left behind and the enduring human need to find the truth, no matter how long it takes. I hope these accounts have given you a new perspective on the world around you. If you've made it this far, you're the reason I tell these stories. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and always keep an eye on the shadows.